The next speaker will be speaking through Zoom because he really wanted to be here in person, but in his role as Director of Repatriation and Indigenous Relations for the Canadian Museum of History, he has to be physically elsewhere at this time. So John Moses is going to speak to us next. And Dane, are you able to get that set up? Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much. My name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I'm also the Director for Repatriation and Indigenous Relations here at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, Canada. I'm not presently a Lenape speaker, but I do have a bit of Mohawk, and here it is. Sego Skenaguaga, Sawadis Moses, Young Yats. Ganyatse Angwahoy, Ganyatse Hodno Shoni, Ganyengahega, Tano Lene Lenape. My name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario. That's where both my parents were born and raised, and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. My father was the late Russ Moses. He was a residential school survivor, a naval veteran of the Korean War, an Air Force veteran of the Cold War, and a public servant whose various achievements included being the Deputy Commissioner General of the Indians of Canada Pavilion at Montreal's Expo 67, which pavilion is today recognized as being a watershed in Indigenous self-representation before national and global audiences. My mother is Helen Montour Moses. She's 93 now. She followed her own mother, Edith Anderson Montour, into the nursing profession. And Helen was one of the founding members in the 1970s of the original Canadian Indian Nurses Association, for which work she received her Eagle Feather. So anyways, I'm telling you all of this just so you know exactly who I am and where I'm coming from in all respects. I want to acknowledge, of course, our Indigenous veterans and elders and the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, from which I'm joining you here today in Gatineau, Quebec. Now, historically, wherever a geographic, economic, and political factor so dictated, the British Crown and other imperial powers in North America all sought to include Indigenous allies as part of their overall military and strategic alliances. For their own part, Indigenous groups and individuals either accepted, rejected, or modified these overtures in accordance with their own objectives. 20th century overseas military service by Indigenous peoples from Canada was contentious and fraught with the potential for unintended outcomes, both for those on the front lines and for those at home. Quite aside from the possibility, of course, for death and injury for combatants, for those at home, these unanticipated consequences included family and marital breakdown as parents, older siblings, and other role models and caregivers departed for war work or for their own military service, the co-committant transfer of at least some of these children involved to residential schools, challenges to traditional political authority, and the loss of land as portions of some reserves were seized for military purposes, and the forced agricultural labor of Indian children at Canada's residential schools, as at least some of the schools were converted to meet civilian food production needs during the wartime emergency. All of these outcomes were experienced by my own family members to varying degrees. Now, in respect of residential schools, many of the schools had been run along military lines to begin with, and the exceptionally austere living conditions under even normal and routine peacetime conditions were akin to military service. Many Indigenous families over the span of generations share this history of both residential school attendance and later military service. Thus, there were combined wartime and multi-generational residential schools legacies that continue to negatively impact Indigenous families and communities to the present day. And this has certainly been the situation in my own extended family over many generations now. Now, notwithstanding that under Canada's Colonial Indian Act legislation, they were actively denied the full rights and benefits of Canadian citizenship at home, Indigenous troops of the World Wars were at the very forefront in fulfilling abroad that most onerous and profound obligation of citizenship and sovereignty in donning uniform and bearing arms against the nation's enemies. It must be emphasized that the Indigenous military service was never undertaken lightly, nor out of some quaint or naive sense of patriotism to the Crown. The question of whether to support Canadian and Imperial military efforts was divisive within Indigenous communities and families across the country, and even amongst those who did volunteer, individual motivations varied greatly, spanning the material to the political. Some, like many settler Canadians, were attracted by the perceived material benefits and advantages of regular food, payment, clothing, and shelter. At Six Nations at the time of the Great War, some perceived themselves historically in the vein of Joseph Brant and his quote-unquote, His Majesty's Indian allies. Others were more future-oriented and felt that come the victorious peacetime that no one doubted, the fact of their recent military service overseas would provide them with greater leverage in advancing the case of Six Nations rights on the national and world stage. Now, I want to state from the outset that I would not presume to speak of any community other than my own, which, as I say, is the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And within that, I would not presume to speak of any families other than my own, which matrilineally are the Montour and Anderson families, and which patrilineally is the Moses family. By utilizing poetry, letters, diaries, telegrams, and photographs, and the traditional knowledge and oral histories of extended Moses, which are Lenape Band, and Montour families with Upper Mohawk Band at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, this presentation traces the wartime service and ultimate fate of selected Six Nations band members, all of whom are family to me. These include my maternal grandmother, Great War U.S. Army nurse Edith Anderson Montour, great uncle and aviator Lieutenant James David Moses, great uncle infantryman Arnold Moses, great uncle artillery and engineering officer Gilbert Montour, second cousin World War II tank crewman Jess Moses, and my paternal grandfather Ted Moses, a Royal Canadian Air Force airframe mechanic, and my own late father Russ Moses, who, as they say, was a residential school survivor and subsequently a naval veteran of the Korean War and an Air Force veteran of the Cold War. So if we could advance, if you're running the, yes, great, thank you. So what follows is a highly personalized account of Six Nations contributions to the Allied and British Empire war efforts of the 20th century, with a unique commentary on the fortunes of war from an unfiltered, first-hand Indigenous perspective. Now, despite the fact that the governing Six Nations Confederacy hereditary chiefs and clan mothers espoused a stance of diplomatic neutrality at the outbreak of the Great War, more than 300 Six Nations band members volunteered to serve. Such a response was in itself a challenge to the traditional authority of the Confederacy system. Of the more than 300 who volunteered, 292 finally shipped overseas. Of these, 38 were killed in action, reported missing, or died of wounds or illness. With losses exceeding 1 in 10, the Six Nations troops of the First World War were thus literally decimated. Upon their return home following the war, some of the surviving Six Nations veterans assumed leadership of a pre-existing political reform movement called the Dehorners. The Dehorner mandate was to remove the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers from power and to introduce band council elections consistent with the Indian Act of that era on the basis of one male elector, one vote. The Dehorners were relatively few in number, but well organized by virtue of their military training and experience. In the hyper-nationalistic and patriotic environment of post-war Canadian society, they emphasized the differences between themselves as newly returned war veterans versus the neutral stance of the Confederacy chiefs and its supporters. They actively colluded with the Dominion government to achieve their end, which was in fact accomplished in 1924. Ever since, there have been those individuals, extended families, and lineages at Six Nations that continue to support government by Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers versus those that support Indian Act-style band council elections. As with any community, others remain apolitical. Now, notwithstanding any of the foregoing, Six Nations and Indigenous individuals and families in general were apparently generally prepared to support the Crown's war efforts and the notion of a strong and united Empire and Dominion of Canada, so long as that same Crown demonstrated respect of Aboriginal and treaty rights in return. Ultimately, Six Nations troops' individual service in wartime was in the context of the historic Covenant Chain Wampum Accord, signifying diplomatic partnerships in peace and military alliance during war. My intention in offering the following family profiles is to highlight the diversity of the Six Nations military and wartime experience during the 20th century. So here we are looking at my maternal grandmother, Edith Anderson Montour. Her dates are 1890 to 1996. Now, as a young woman, my maternal grandmother, Edith Anderson Montour, was determined to become a nurse. Unfortunately, Indian Act restrictions of her era prevented her from pursuing higher education without the threat of loss of her legal Indian status and registered band membership. Her strategy around this was to pursue her training in the United States. She was living and working as a public health nurse and school nurse in New York City when the United States entered the First World War in 1917. Volunteering for duty with the U.S. Army Nurse Corps of the American Expeditionary Force, she served overseas in France at U.S. Army Base Hospital number 23 in Vittel, before returning to the US and eventually to Canada in 1919, by which time the former Indian Act restrictions were no longer in force. Once back at Six Nations, she married and raised her own family, including my mother Helen, and continued nursing and working as a midwife until finally retiring in the 1960s. Recognized now as the first Indigenous registered nurse in Canada, Grandmother Edith was a pioneer of Indigenous healthcare, although these same sources typically neglect to include that it was the provisions of Canada's own racist Indian Act legislation of her era that obliged her to initially pursue her calling in another country in the first place. By virtue of her Allied veteran status under Canada's 1917 Wartime Election Act and the Military Voters Act, she was also the first female status Indian registered band member to be able to vote in a Canadian federal election, which right she proudly exercised. Her compassion is evident in the following extract from her wartime diary, which is still maintained as a treasured heirloom in our extended family today. This is the entry for Sunday, June the 16th, 1918. My pet patient, Earl King, the boy who had adopted me as his big sister, died this morning at 7:15. He had had a hemorrhage at 3:15. The poor boy lost consciousness immediately. My heart is broken. I went to the florist and ordered flowers for my boy who had died. At 3 p.m., I went to his funeral. It rained throughout the whole ceremony and my feet were soaking, but I didn't mind. At least I paid my respects to Earl. Following this sad event, Edith wrote personally to the boy's parents to let him know that he was not alone when he died. Following the war, they exchanged visits, with Edith traveling to Iowa and Mr. and Mrs. King eventually visiting grandmother at the Six Nations Reserve. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Now here we have pictured my great uncle, James Moses. His dates were in 1890 to 1918. Employed as a school teacher at the Six Nations Reserve when the Great War began, James Moses served as an infantry officer with Canada's two largely Indigenous formations of the First World War, the 114th Battalion, Brock's Rangers, and the 107th Timberwolf Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps in 1917. Trained as an air gunner and forward artillery observer with the Royal Flying Corps, Lieutenant Moses was reported missing, later confirmed as killed in action while serving with number 57 Squadron on April the 1st of 1918. As April the 1st of 1918 marks the official birth date of the famed Royal Air Force, with the amalgamation that day of the former Royal Navy Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps, one of the first battle casualties of the famed RAF was in fact Lieutenant Moses, a Delaware band member from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Upon receiving word of his son's fate, his father, Nelson Moses, wrote the following lines in honor of his son, Jim, in a poem entitled The Missing Airman. Oh, sometimes yet I feel lonely for him who went away overseas. Time's healing wing and time only can soothe the empty heart with ease. That parting hour was hard to bear when we shook hands and said goodbye. Hope alone breathed over our prayers while tears rose up and dimmed each eye. But our mother in sore distress was heard from beyond the restless wave. Her sons faltered not in her stress, it would be victory or the grave. Jim sleeps with many comrades brave. Sleep on, your battle is done. No lonely cross will mark the grave where rests the empire's warrior son. And I would emphasize that this poem has actually been translated into Lenape by Ian McCallum, who I believe is present at the symposium today. Now, for full disclosure, both the father, Nelson Moses, and the son, James Moses, were active members, leaders, in fact, of the DeHorner movement to remove the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers and to institute Indian Act-style band council elections. So too was another son and younger brother, Arnold Moses, whose story follows here. Next slide, please. And this is Arnold pictured in the center of this particular photograph. His dates are 1898 to 1951. Originally a family farmhand at Six Nations, Arnold Cornelius Moses served successively with the 114th and 107th Battalions Canadian Expeditionary Force before ending the war with the Canadian Engineers. He remained active in both the Canadian militia and in elected band council politics during the interwar years. He served as elected band council chief for a 2-year term spanning 1949 and 1950. He died in 1951 at the relatively young age of 54. Published tributes following his death included the following. The Indians of Canada have lost a wise and good leader in Arnold C. Moses at Ashwaubenon, Ontario, and that's the village center at Six Nations. Truly, he gave his life for the welfare of all Indian people. It was the stress and strain of the long legal battle between the Six Nations and the federal government over their claim to the now defunct Grand River Navigation Company and his contributions in presenting a brief regarding the recent amendment of the Indian Act that sapped his strength and health beyond repair. Born in 1898, Mr. Moses was a member of the Delaware tribe. In 1915, at the age of 17, he joined the Canadian Army, going overseas with the 114th Battalion. In 1919, after 3 years and 3 months of service, he was retired from the Royal Canadian Engineers with the rank of lieutenant. And that is a profile from a publication called The Native Voice, dated November 1951. Now, the following tribute was from Brigadier Oliver Martin, who coincidentally had served alongside Lieutenant Jim Moses in both the Canadian Expeditionary Force and later in the Royal Air Force during the Great War. Arnold, as a young man, served his country well as a soldier overseas during the First World War. After the hostilities ended, he continued in the service of his country as an officer of the Haldeman Rifles in command of the All-Indian Regiment of the All-Indian Company of that regiment. He lived close to the soil on his well-managed farm on the Six Nations Reserve, gave his children a good education, and was a leader amongst the people. He took an active and leading part in Canadian political thought. And those are remarks by retired Brigadier General Oliver Martin that appeared in the Indian Voice, or the Native Voice, likewise in November of 1951. Next slide, please. This is Gilbert Clarence Montour, whose dates were 1895 to 1973. I recall my maternal great uncle, Gilbert Montour, simply as Uncle Gib, as he was known across our extended family. He was a younger brother to Edith's husband, Claiborne Montour. Edith and Claiborne were my mother's parents, and thus my maternal grandparents. I remember Uncle Gib as a gruff elder with a gallows sense of humor. By the time I can remember him, he was in declining health following a series of heart attacks, for which, in his word, the only outcome was a dose of graveyard mold. To give him his due, I will quote from one of the published accounts concerning him, which appeared during his lifetime while still in his prime. The following extract is from a newspaper article entitled "Canadian Metals Expert Montour Aids Malaya," from Volume 1, Number 1 of the August 1954 issue of the Indian News, which was the departmental newsletter of the Department of Indian Affairs. Dr. Montour recently returned from Malaya, where he was on loan from the Canadian government to the International Bank for Reconstruction and Redevelopment. Dr. Montour served as a teacher on his reserve for some time as a youth. He enrolled in Queen's University, but interrupted his studies because of the First World War, enlisting in 1917 as a gunner. He later gained an officer's commission with the Royal Canadian Engineers. He returned to his studies after the war and graduated in 1921 with a degree of Bachelor of Sciences, majoring in mining and metallurgy. He had continued his military activities in the Reserve Army since the First World War, so he was very disappointed at the start of the Second World War to find that an old injury made him unfit for overseas military service. In 1940, his department lent him to the Department of Munitions and Supply as Chief Executive Officer to the Metals Controller. He was made Canadian Executive Officer of the Combined Allied Production and Resources Board in Washington. His services to the board from 1943 to 1945 were of such importance that he was honored by being made an officer of the Order of the British Empire. Dr. Montour's outstanding services to Canada, both in war and in peace, have won him national acclaim, and in particular, the pride of his own people. Next slide, please. Jess Moses Jr., pictured here, his dates were 1900 until 1973, 1919 until 2011. Now, a Delaware band member from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and a farmer by vocation, my second cousin, Jess Moses, enlisted with the 11th Canadian Armored Regiment, the Ontario Tank Regiment, soon after the outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939. Following initial training in Canada and the United Kingdom, Trooper Moses fought with his unit throughout Sicily, Italy, and Northwest Europe, including the liberation of Belgium and Holland, and his letters home to his betrothed, Olive, span July the 2nd of 1941 to September the 24th of 1945, beginning in England and ending in Holland. Always strictly adhering to wartime censorship rules, Jess's letters are nearly bereft of any technical or operational details of interest to a military historian, but this is understandable given his recipient and their relationship. He wanted to encourage and support Olive during their forced separation and not to worry her. Nevertheless, the letters and a handful of photographs do provide a snapshot of the daily round and the thoughts and feelings of a young Indigenous serviceman from Canada in the thick of things during wartime. And this is from a letter dated January the 9th of 1944. Dear Olive, I'll bet my letters have dropped off considerably over the last month. There was only one reason for that. Old Jerry was seeing to it that we didn't have any time to write. Right now, we are having a rest period. I could go on and tell you of stories of what we did and saw, but what's the use? All I can say is that we have seen war at its worst. For being in tight corners, our tank crew has had its fill. So much of the war end of it. We have been practically living in our tanks. It's surprising what good kitchenettes they make. We spent the most horrid New Year's Eve that I ever spent and ever hope to spend again. It was raining like sin, and we were sitting about 50 yards from the Jerry's lines. When we got out of their tank, we would sink up to our knees in mud. What a time we had. Next slide, please. This is my paternal grandfather, Ted Moses, my father's father. His dates were 1900 to 1948. Now, 3 generations of the Moses family were raised at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Brantford. My great-grandfather, Nelson Moses, was there in the 1880s. My grandfather, Ted, pictured here, was there in the 1910s, and my late father, Russ Moses, was there in the 1940s. The Mohawk Institute was originally founded by the New England Company and later operated on contract for the Government of Canada by the Anglican Church. When my great-grandfather Nelson Moses was there in the 1880s, it was run essentially as a missionary school where likely young men and women from the Six Nations community were sent to be trained as Indigenous Anglican clergy and teachers to be sent out west as the process of treaty making continued and as new Indian reserves were being set aside. When my grandfather Ted was there in the 19-teens, it was a military-themed boarding school during the era of global militarization that preceded the outbreak of the Great War. Ted became a welder by trade, and at the outbreak of the Second World War, although deemed too old for overseas service, was eagerly recruited as a corporal airframe mechanic by the Royal Canadian Air Force, repairing damaged aircraft at British Commonwealth air training bases across southern Ontario. Apparently unwilling to forego the opportunity of military service during wartime and thus acquiring coveted warrior and veteran status, Ted served in this capacity while his wife, my paternal grandmother, Augusta, suffered a mental collapse and was hospitalized, and while his 3 children, including my father, Russ, were sent to the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School for the duration of the war and 2 years beyond. Ted was killed in a car accident soon after the war. Next slide, please. So this is my father, Russ Moses. He was born on August the 8th of 1932 and sadly passed away from service-related illness on the 22nd of May, 2013. Now, my father, Russ, with an older brother, Elliot, and a younger sister, Thelma, attended the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School under exceptionally severe wartime and immediate post-war conditions from 1942 to 1947. The Mohawk Institute degenerated throughout the decade of the 1920s and 30s and the era of the Great Depression. My father and his siblings had the misfortune of being sent there at the height of the Second World War, by which time any pretense towards providing education or vocational training had been abandoned. The Indigenous children who were there to provide the forced agricultural labor necessary to keep the large farm operation going as a contribution to the civilian food production effort on the Canadian home front during wartime. The Mohawk Institute itself sat on 350 acres of prime southern Ontario farmland with varieties of crops, orchards, and livestock under cultivation. Sadly, the children themselves derived no benefit from their labors and on occasion were reduced to begging on the streets of Brantford to help sustain themselves. A few extracts from my father's residential school memoir, which he wrote in 1965, will suffice. The senior boys worked on the farm, and I mean we worked hard all the time. We were underfed, exhausted, ill-clad, and out in all types of weather. There's certainly something to be said for Indian stamina. When I was asked to do this paper, I had some misgivings, for if I were to be honest, I must tell you of things as they were, and really this is not my story, this is yours. And the photograph that you're looking at right now was taken in August of 19 1965 upon my father's release from the Royal Canadian Air Force, and it was also the year within which he wrote his memoir. Now, notwithstanding the tragic circumstances of childhood abuse and neglect described in his complete memoir, as Russ's son, it's important for me to convey to all of you that Russ refused to be defined by his residential school experience. While he never hid that experience, neither did he dwell upon it. Beyond his upbringing, my father was a decorated naval veteran of the Korean War, an Air Force veteran of the Cold War, and an accomplished public servant whose many achievements included being Deputy Commissioner General of the groundbreaking Indians of Canada Pavilion at Montreal's Expo 67, now recognized as a watershed in Indigenous self-representation. Most importantly, Russ was a loving, kind, and gentle family man. Next slide, please. So thank you for hearing me out during this recounting of Six Nations oral history and one extended family's traditional knowledge. If any generalization can be made regarding the spectrum of military service experiences described here, in each instance, I would simply say it was ultimately within the spirit and intent of the original Covenant Chain Wampum Belt Accord between the Six Nations Confederacy of Iroquois and allied Indian nations, including the Delaware or Lenape, and the British Crown, signifying trading and economic relations during peace and military alliance during war. So thank you very much, Niawe. That's the end of my presentation.
Niawen. Thank you, John. Can you hear me thanking you?
Yes, I can. Yep. Thank you very much.
I don't know if you can hear us. Okay, good. If there are any questions from the audience, I could repeat that at the podium, or you could come to the podium to ask it for John. We have a couple of minutes before we go to lunch.
Okay.
So anyone has a question? Velma?
Items at that museum that he's at that I'm curious about. I tried to get them like 15 years ago. And since he's there, can I get his contact? Because he might be, you know, he might help us get things back.
John, I don't know if you heard that question, so I'm going to repeat it. Velma Noah Nicholas was saying that a number of years ago, maybe 15 years ago, she was trying to inquire about some items held at museum where you are. And she was wondering if it's okay to get in contact to see if there's a way to facilitate that.
Yep, sure. My email address here at the Canadian Museum of History, it's all lowercase. It's john.moses@historymuseum.ca. And John is, well, John. So john.moses@historymuseum.ca.
Anybody else have a question? Cody, do you want to come on up? Yeah.
So John knows me, so I won't introduce myself, but it's Cody Grote, John.
Yep, good to see you.
So interestingly, with 1924 coming up and the imposition of the elected council over the hereditary government, and I know, as you mentioned, after World War I, a lot of soldiers from Six Nations, including my great-grandfather, were involved in some of those petitions. And I'm curious if you're contributing in any of those discussions about 1924 and the anniversary coming up next year, and sort of your thoughts on how 1924 should be marked from the veteran perspective, I guess.
Yeah, well, certainly I've been in touch for a couple of years now with Heather George, originally when she was working as a researcher at the Woodland Cultural Center, and now I guess for about a year now, she's actually been the director of the Woodland Museum. So I know she's been working on that exhibit for a couple of years now with other, with some certain Six Nations band members herself, including my cousin Rick Montour and other people like Rick Hill. So it's getting a lot of good support from people within the community. So yes, I'm aware of the exhibition. I have been providing information to Heather and to others so that they are aware of the role of the Moses family of that generation in this DeHorner movement. It's a very complicated topic. It remains a very contentious issue. When the Confederacy chiefs were basically deposed by the government of Canada in 1924, this was there's a mythology that's still widely held out there today that this was a unilateral and arbitrary intervention of the Dominion government, which is not the case. People don't like hearing this, but there was an organized political reform movement at the Six Nations of the Grand River that began leaving its paper trail, certainly by the 1860s and into the 1870s. It was only following the end of the First World War and the assumption of a leadership position by some newly returned Six Nations veterans of the Great War in that pre-existing DeHorner movement that the Dominion government finally intervened. And indeed, there was that definitive change that was made in 1924. And so, as I mentioned in my remarks, ever since 1924, there have been those extended families that continue to support the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers versus those extended families that support the Indian Act style band council elections. And again, as with any demographic or any community, there are other people who are essentially apolitical. They might support the stance, depending upon what the issue is. They might support the Confederacy chiefs and clan mothers on one issue while supporting the while supporting the elected band council position on another. That's just the nature of politics.
Any other questions? Then we just say, Nyawa, thank you again to John. And let me just make a brief announcement. For those who are having lunch, just make sure to show your ticket to the server. It's the same place where we had breakfast. And I also want to mention that they'll continue having the lunch area open until 1:30. You're welcome though to sit, like the serving area will close at 1:30, but we're welcome to sit in there as long as we want. And the bus taking us down to Princeton University Library will leave at 2 o'clock sharp. And it's just outside by parking lot B near the dining hall, the same place that we got onto the vehicles when we went, for those who were here at Language Camp in July, same place. Okay, and just maybe we can thank John one more time.